your way is another keynote on the topic Creative Skills for Future by Ms. Paula Graham. Can I have you on stage, ma'am? Definitely, I would love to introduce her as well to all of you. As a consultant, she has 20 years experience of design through research, collaborative, cross-disciplinary and cross-sector research. This includes public engagement consultancy in UKRI funded design through research collaborations, as well as working with NGOs to design and develop innovative service supported by interactive digital platforms. External relations, networking, partnership development, writing for publication, and public speaking are key to her work, as well as monitoring digital innovative policy and trends. Later shall be listened to her. Over to you, ma'am.
Hi. Good. Okay. Besides the consultancy work, I also have a role in the UK in advising the government on UK creative industries. And so the presentation that I'm going to give you is based on my experience of the structure of the industry in the UK. But I've done my best to research how this relates to the Indian sectors. And you will be able to tell me how well I've done that at the end of the presentation. So this is a graphic that's a couple of years old. The reason I'm using it, although it's UK, is because if you look at the panel in the middle, the spread of where Indian graduates are going in the industry is similar in India. So you have about a third of students will go into creative jobs in creative industries. So that means in film, TV, design, etc. About a third of them will end up doing administrative jobs in creative industries, and another third will end up working in a non-creative industry, such as engineering, in the design department. So, as far as I understand, the spread in India is very similar. So if you're studying design as a student now, you will be going into one of these three sectors when you graduate. So in India, as in the world in general, in the UK, creative jobs are growing at almost double the rate of job growth in other sectors. In India, this is even more marked. So you can see that there is going to be an enormous shortage of qualified designers in India in the future. So you can see that around 2,000 designers will be wanted. And at the moment we're training, 20,000. At the moment we're training a fraction of that. So as designers, you will be going into a market which is very hungry for your skills. We're also, as you know, in a moment of extreme rapid technological development. So the skills areas in terms of technology that are emerging will be digital UX, strategic brand management, which is basically being able to use machine learning and data to develop a more strategic approach to business development through using communications. And also you will use that in product and service design to situate yourself before you start designing so that you understand the environment that you're designing into. Augmented, hybrid and virtual reality. And if you're ISCA students, I know that you're already playing with VR technologies. CGI and animation, 3D printing, and also data visualization design. I've seen some really exciting work doing things like taking medical data and turning these massive data sets. So for example, the UK Health Service has one of the biggest data sets in the world because they have data on every human being who has ever lived since 1950. And you can use visualization techniques to make these huge data sets understandable for human beings. And that's an area of design that you may not have thought about. 3D printing you're probably familiar with. So the question then becomes, is creative higher education keeping up with these trends? And in the UK, we're having significant problems with the higher education sector, the creative education sector, falling behind the industry. because the industry is changing very, very fast, and it's much harder for an educational institution, particularly a government educational institution, which I'm sure you will be familiar, perhaps the older people amongst you, with how difficult it is, because when you're running a government institution, you're accountable, and it becomes very difficult to move quickly. And the other problem that we have is that very often, for historical reasons, which I won't bore you with, UK creative education has become more and more theoretical, and people tend to have the skills that they had when they graduated 20 years before. So we're looking at quite a problem in higher education around creativity in the UK. So very recently I was at a meeting of senior advertising executives to discuss the issue of higher education and skills. And all of them were saying to me, you're producing graduates who don't have the skills that we need. And we think we needn't send them to university at all, we will just train them on the job. So I said, hands up, which of you went to university? And so everybody went to a creative university, and everybody in the room has a degree from a creative university. So I'm thinking, perhaps you're being too ambitious in thinking that you don't need to have creative universities anymore. So the universities now have to deal with a very different working environment for creative graduates. Graduate designers now need advanced technical, innovation and strategic skills, which they would not have needed 10 years ago. The industry is becoming increasingly precarious, and I'll get to that, more about that in a minute, but more and more designers are working freelance and struggling to keep a consistent income, and they don't have the skills. We are not sending them into the world with the skills they need to do that. Click work is eroding wages for 2D technical skills. So if you're a graphic designer now, if you're in the UK, then you're competing with designers in India whose cost of living is much lower. In India, you're going to find over the next decade that you will be competing with people in other parts of Asia where the cost of living is much lower. So you need to get your skills up higher so that you can continue to stay above that problem. The other thing is that there's a phrase called above the algorithm, which means that human skills still exceed what machine learning can do. So I'm going to digress for a moment and talk about the difference between AI and machine learning, because when I'm doing the research, I'm seeing that people are very unclear on this distinction. So artificial intelligence is something called general artificial intelligence, which means a machine that can think in a sophisticated way as a human being, that can take in new information and make decisions about it. Machine learning is the capacity of a machine to process large amounts of data, to learn in a limited sense, and to make predictions. We are nowhere near general intelligence. We're working with machine learning at the moment. And machine learning is really important in all 3D skills. So if you only have flat 2D skills, you're going to find that you're competing with a lot of people in the world who have flat 2D skills. And you need to be able to use machine learning in your design in order to stay above the algorithm, which means that you are taking data, but you are making human decisions about it. And you will want to be looking for a job that is above the algorithm, where you need cognitive skills that machines cannot yet do. So my very strong advice to students at the moment is to be able to think, to learn skills that are higher level than machines can currently do. So real intelligence. The other complaint which the advertising industry was telling me was that the graduates lack life skills for competitive industries, and they have a lack of problem solving or entrepreneurial skills, and all of these are generally known as cognitive skills. So it's very important for higher education sector now, and I'm sorry, they've destroyed my presentation with a different software, so it's all falling off the bottom. We now need, as a higher education sector, to be teaching these cognitive skills. So industry is demanding both high-level computer skills, a lot of which are data-driven, but they also need high-level strategic skills if you're going to be competitive in a global market. So what is the value add of creative education that makes it better to go through creative education than just to go into a job and learn while you're there? And I've deliberately drawn this hand drawing to give you an idea of the kinds of things that a university environment can provide for students that can't be provided in on-the-job learning. What we can do in a university is provide a challenging environment where students have the space to think through problems, to interact in different environments, to begin to understand how to think for yourself and to develop these higher cognitive skills. And it is quite impossible to provide this environment in a corporate sector. This is where the university, the creative university, adds value and can produce the graduates that we need for the future who have these innovative and cognitive higher level above the algorithm skills, things that machines can't yet do. And cognitive skills are likely to remain above the algorithm for another 50 years. I was talking to data scientists at Imperial, which is in the top 10 or 15 of international universities, and they're telling me that machines will not be able to carry out higher level cognitive skills for at least another 50 years. So if you're looking to ensure that when you have 2 children and you need to put them in college, you still have a job, you will be wanting to get the higher cognitive skills. So design is now at the heart, and Jonathan was just talking about this, design is at the heart of emerging business and production processes. So these days, instead of going in and putting a nice package on it and then designing an advertisement, increasingly you will need to be at the table in the very first moment when they're discussing where to take the company next. Because design and communications are absolutely key to business processes and development in a sophisticated organization now, in the kind of global organization that you will maybe working in a city like Bangalore. Design thinking and design-driven innovation. Design thinking is a concept that has had a lot of criticism. So the idea of design thinking is precisely that you are thinking in this much wider way. And people have been quite critical that this becomes too abstract. But you're actually applying this to material situations, and recent research is talking about design-driven innovation, material design thinking. So you're applying this kind of critical thinking not only to strategic marketing plans, but also to how you develop actual products or services. So design attitude is another phrase that is running around at the moment. And that's about connecting and creating. So that's the kind of work that I do, which is about working out who needs to talk to who and what kind of influences and spaces need to inform your design process. Brand strategy and business development. The other day, a young student was saying to me, how would I get into the UK? I'm like, well, to get into the UK, you have to be in the above the medium earnings. And to do that, I suggest you study brand strategy. So again, if you want to be in the global market, you need to be competitive with students who are graduated in the UK, Europe, and America. And a strategic cognitive approach is absolutely key. The other emerging trend is sustainable design. And again, this is quite an interesting question in India, because most Indian people that I talk to will want to prioritize development over sustainability. So, and it's a very reasonable criticism that the UK has already burned all its trees and its coal and has developed, and you can shut up telling us that we need to be more sustainable. But I think the issue is that it's going to affect developing or emerging economies with more problems than it will in the developing world. So sustainable, and the other thing is that you have an opportunity, if you're developing infrastructure, to leapfrog. And I'll talk more about leapfrogging in a minute. So sustainable design, I think, is going to be an increasingly important aspect of design in emerging economies. And I don't think it's something that you should dismiss. But you can argue with me, and you will, but I really think that it's extremely important to be looking at sustainability in design and building sustainability into your design thinking and these cognitive processes that I'm talking about. So a couple of years ago, there's an organisation called Creative and Cultural Skills in the UK, whose business in life is to carry out research to tell the government what's going on and what they need to do. So a couple of years ago, they surveyed the creative sector and asked senior managers and leaders what they thought was important about future skills. So actually, I was quite surprised when I read the report, because I was expecting it would just be, you know, CGI, artificial intelligence, blah, blah, you know, the usual suspects that I talked about on my first slide. But actually, that's not what they said. Higher level computing skills, indeed, 70% of leaders in the UK think that those are going to be crucial. But also, 53% thought that business marketing and communication skills was an area where they were unable to recruit at the moment, where there were skill shortages. Problem-solving skills, almost 50% of industry leaders thought we don't have enough problem-solving skills. And vocational skills relating to business support, which made me think, what on earth are they? But they're basically, how do you run a business? So if you're going into the entrepreneurial sector and you've got no idea how to run a business, like, for example, recently a young freelancer said to me, oh my God, the government has sent me a tax bill for £5,000. I don't have it. And I'm like, well, didn't somebody tell you that this would happen and you have to save a quarter of your income through the year so that you can pay this bill? No, nobody told me. Well, I think that's quite criminal that nobody told her. And it's important that if employers are not going to tell people this kind of thing when they employ freelancers, that it's important that the higher education sector is making sure that we're sending students, graduates, into the world understanding basic business processes. The other thing, which is fallen off the bottom of the slide, but I vaguely remember was there, and I've now forgotten again. It's gone, sorry. So how is the higher education sector going to meet these skills requirements? Because quite often, actually, those cognitive skills and how they relate to the industry is something that actually the teachers in higher education don't know either, because it's changed since they were qualified. So we need a much more permeable institution. Ideally, we would like to see teaching staff moving between industry and higher education so that their skills are always fresh. We need to focus on cognitive as well as technical skills. So these higher level, above the algorithm skills is an area where we really need to be focusing when we're training graduates. We need to foster a collaborative culture of innovation and entrepreneurialism. And also, the other thing that UK universities actually are quite good at doing is seeing an emerging trend and setting up a course which addresses it. So it's very important that, again, that we're in touch with industry and understanding what industry's needs are so that we can respond with courses that are tailored, which has the two advantages in that our graduates, it enhances the reputation of the university, because graduates will want to go to a university that is going to prepare them in this way. So knowledge exchange, which is my specialism. The UK now includes a measurement of success in knowledge exchange when they allocate research funds in UK universities. So you probably don't know, but in the UK, there's a pool of research funding. There's a research council whose business is to develop the creative industries. And you have to prove that the research that you're doing has a real impact in society before they will give you any money, basically. Which I think is a very good thing, because there's a terrible tendency in developed countries for researchers to just, it's called scratching an itch, to think, oh, I wonder, you know, what makes fish green, and then they'll do a great research, but no one cares, other than them, what makes fish green. So they're bringing in a structure in the UK to kind of like discipline researchers a little bit to be actually solving problems that other people care about. So in the UK, we also have something called the Cultural Capital Exchange Network, whose business is to connect universities, NGOs, and academic institutions. Because again, as I'll say in a minute, NGOs are an important part of the mix that is often ignored because the government wants to develop industry. And I'm constantly having to point out to them that NGOs are actually industry and are part of the overall mix, because NGOs can be much more experimental because they have more space, they have funding, grant funding from trusts, so they're able to be much more innovative. And they're usually closer to communities, so they're able to solve problems which communities have because they understand those communities. So how do we shape a challenge-driven creative academic sector in the Indian context? Which is a question that, I would need to work with you guys to understand. I can't work this software. Okay. So how do we do engaged design from the start? So there was a very interesting paper, again, about 3 years ago from Nesta, which is the organisation in the UK. It's what we call a quango, which means it's sort of government, but sort of not. And their business is to drive innovation in the UK. So the guy who heads that up, Hassan Bakshi, published a paper a couple of years ago called The Challenge-Driven University, where he talked about how we need, oh God, it's gone off the bottom again, how we need to generate additional income, because UK universities are also under pressure to create income. And in India, this problem is going to be even bigger in the private sector because your income is basically from student fees. You don't have a lot of spare cash to be doing this kind of work. So universities are finding, in the UK, are finding more and more inventive ways of getting some more money in so that we can do this kind of research. So one of the things is design consultancy. So, for example, one of the universities in Cardiff has a whole consultancy division which sells the results of research to industry. So you go out and you do a bit of research, you find out something interesting, and you used to just publish it, which I actually think is a nice system, but if the government won't fund stuff, what can you do? So now instead of that, they actually sell it as consultancy, which brings money into the university, which means that you've now got a little bit of funding to do more of the engagement work with other sectors. The other area that's quite useful is CPD short courses, because as I'm saying, the skills are changing so fast that even the teachers can't keep up. People in industry can't keep up half the time. So we now sell short courses. So they're maybe 6 weeks long, and they're just refreshers for people who already have professional skills to just catch them up with emerging technical or cognitive trends. The other thing that is really interesting, and one of the areas that I find particularly enjoyable personally, is partnering with NGOs to solve social problems. And India is particularly good at this. And it's my feeling that India's capacity with this has been one of the things that's driven its technical supremacy, increasing technical supremacy on the global stage. So, for example, actually the example I'm about to give is African, but it'll work. For example, you have a country where pretty much nobody has a bank account and there's not really a retail banking sector. Now, this holds you back, obviously, because it's very difficult to do more sophisticated levels of business if you have no banking. But there's no way that 3 researchers can develop a retail banking system and make it affordable for farmers in rural areas. So this is how mobile banking was born. We now have a lag in the West where we're trying to catch up with the innovative financial instruments in retail banking that are being used in Africa and Asia. So working with NGOs, working with communities, solving problems can actually cause the entire economy to leapfrog over the West, and the West is left scrambling to catch up. And this is another reason why I'm quite keen on sustainable, because that's another area where those industries are industries of the future. So I have to say, a lot of the time when I'm talking to people in India, there's a kind of tendency to, because you don't want to be driven by foreign ideas, of rejecting the very areas where you could be leapfrogging and doing something really useful and economically developing, but you're sort of, no, we don't want to hear about that. And I think it's very important to be open to ideas and to see how you apply them in the local context, rather than just saying, we're different, we're not going to, of course you're different, but how are you going to develop that idea if you're not open to exploring it? I managed to turn a page. So we were just working on something in the UK called the Creative Careers Programme, and that's something I really would like to see something similar in India. The problem that we're trying to solve is that because all of this is so new and moving so fast, parents in particular, and also industry, leaders, managers, no idea what's going on. And obviously this is a huge problem in trying to develop effective educational provision. So parents in the UK are very reluctant to send their children on creative courses. Now, I know that this is a fast-growing market, which is relatively future-proof, and that it's a really good idea for them to send their kids to creative university, but they have an idea of creative as something that you do if you can't get into a science university, you know. So we need to actually get a more factual appreciation of the real situation out there. And also, because these roles are changing so quickly and the skills are changing so quickly, we need to get information about what you would actually be training for, what it looks like, and who's going to employ you. So one of the organizations that I work with, we were commissioned to do part of this because they did a different exercise for each of the sectors. So we did the sector for visual culture. So basically, what they've done is work with each of the different sectors to define key roles in that sector. We've done cards which name the role, tell you who's likely to employ you and what sort of earnings you would get in that role, and how you need to train for that role and how you get started in that role. And these are now going up on the websites for the bodies that serve those sectors, but also on the national website for CC Skills. And I think it would be really useful to do something like that in India. Okay, so in future also, it's becoming increasingly important that industry is engaged with the creative university. So one of the projects that I really liked recently in London, I was at a meeting, and there's a guy from Middlesex University, which has a media department. And their media department is extremely theoretical, and in general, the media industries in the UK have complete contempt for media courses because they're very theoretical and don't give the students any technical skills. So in this particular university, a guy who was actually a film producer had taken a job he's retiring and he's tired of the industry, so he took a job in a university, and he arrived there and was kind of slightly horrified at the way that media is being taught there. So he actually worked with his former industry colleagues and got everyone into a meeting to discuss what needs to happen to revitalize media skills. And they came and they actually sat down and discussed. And then he got together the universities, and the universities are in competition with each other economically. And if you'd have asked me, I would have said there is no hope of getting them to collaborate because they want to keep each of them a competitive advantage. But he managed to talk them into getting into a room and discussing how collectively we need to address this problem and develop courses that are more relevant in the media sector. So I was really impressed with that initiative, and I think, again, that's something that might be useful in India. So the campus space of the future will break down conventional barriers across research, education, innovation, public engagement, enable local collaborations with schools. That's another area that's really important, is because I know in India, in UK, the situation is bad in schools in terms of creative education, because the government has taken it into its head that what we need to do is go back 50 years and teach children to, memorize and regurgitate. What can you do? So we now have to repair this problem by sending creatives into schools to add that to the curriculum. And actually, in the Indian system, particularly with private universities, it's actually not a bad thing to do, because it's another way that you can raise awareness of the creative university with schools and parents. So I think that's quite a good thing to do. Also working with community organisation and NGOs, just to make sure that design is rooted in regions, localities and places. So building a creative ecosystem, and my colleague Lydia has spoken about this yesterday in a panel. So Lydia, who you might have seen talking yesterday, is based in something called the East Bank in London, which is, the government likes to call it a powerhouse. And it's reusing all the buildings for the Olympics a few years ago. So it's the biggest single investment in London's culture since the Great Exhibition, and probably, again, you won't know anything about that. But basically, the UK, in the post-war era, as the British Empire was breaking up, began to invest in an idea called soft power. They invested a lot of money into the UK creative sectors in the 1950s and 60s. And it was that time when the UK began to move ahead of America and France. So at that time, we were able to take the market hub for fine art from France, and we've been following in second place behind America ever since from that investment. So the investment that we're seeing into the East Bank and the Olympic Park is on that scale, because we are falling behind again and we really need to push. So that is 3 different universities have created campuses in that environment, and the V&A, which is the foremost craft museum in the UK, has also put a subsidiary into that park, and a lot of NGOs are there. And the Here East is a collaborative working space for freelancers and creatives. So the whole of this space is designed to create the kind of environment that I've just been describing, basically, so that everybody is working in the same space and cross-fertilizing. And we're seeing something similar growing up in Kochi, where there's the Centre for Excellence and the Knowledge Park. And these are the kinds of environments that need to be built to be competitive in the emerging environment. So this is kind of a little diagram which might be useful in getting your head around how that actually works. And that's one of the things that I'm interested in, working to put these pieces together and make the infrastructure that is being built in Kochi really work on a human scale. Creating micro-enterprise. Now, this is an argument that we have with the UK government incessantly. Every week, another argument with the UK government about micro-enterprise. Because there was a research article in 2013, which the government really liked, that said that rapidly scaling creative businesses account for most of the GVR, the value add to the UK economy. So the government was like, great, so we'll stop funding all these wretched micro-enterprises and only fund fast-growing. No, these fast-growing enterprises are completely reliant on the huge freelance and creative micro-businesses, and if you kill them, you'll kill the fast-growing unicorns. For some reason, this concept is extremely hard for governments to get, but it's really important. In order to have an innovative, fast-moving environment, you need all these tiny micro-businesses running around doing interesting and wacky things, basically. The other thing that you find in the UK is, for example, in the media industries, there's all kinds of technical things that need to be done to a film, but it's only about 3 days' work. It would be entirely insane for a studio to keep a tribe of 500 workers to do things that, take 1 day or something. So this is all done by freelancers. So freelancers are micro-businesses are a really important component of the whole mix. And I think it's very easy to think, oh, well, these companies are making loads of money is where we should be paying attention. But no, you need the whole ecosystem, which is why we use the word ecosystem. So, increased digitization of products results in enhanced demand for electronics, and we now get to a very important aspect of the Indian environment. So this is an extract from a report called Design in Industry in Demand. So new technologies can enhance processes in all areas of business, from production through marketing and communication to sales and e-commerce. And Indian companies are now being asked to provide end-to-end product development. So rather than just working on designs, there's increasing need for Indian designers to step up and be able to do this whole development line. I can't turn a page. Okay. So demand growth in India is likely to accelerate with rising disposable incomes, as I'm sure all of you know, and easy access to credit, which means there's a huge opportunity for Indian design and manufacturing. And I think it's probably different. If I'm getting the impression it's very different in South India, but what I'm finding in North India is that the luxury markets are very strongly dominated by foreign design, mostly coming out of the UK or America. and that people sort of have a preference. There's a kind of cachet, there's a status to foreign designed objects. And a lot of this, I hate to say it, but I think it has to do with the confidence of young designers in India, who I think are kind of like a little bit nervous and diffident about really challenging the dominance of this kind of these design traditions. And I really do think that Indian undergraduates really need to be thinking in terms of how you are going to really, instead of looking at Western designs, Indian designers tend to do one of two things. They either look at a traditional Indian design and think, how can we sort of, do a little bit of something to it, or God, my brain's gone. Or they just basically are adopting Western designs and putting a little bit of an Indian spin on it. And the reason why I'm talking constantly about processes and design processes and ecosystems is because what you actually need to be doing is getting in there, and Jonathan's already mentioned this, getting in there, working with people, what are the problems that they have, what is not working in their life, and design that. Because that's how design has always been driven in the West. So, for example, between the wars, because of the Industrial Revolution, all of the people who used to be maids and servants and drivers all went into factories, and the middle classes had no maids. That's why we have vacuum cleaners and dishwashers, because there are no maids. So what you need to do is go out into the environment, see how India is changing, how people's lives are changing, and understand what would enhance people's lives, and do that. And don't care whether it's Indian or this or that or wherever it's from. It doesn't matter. Just take ideas from anywhere and solve problems. That's the nature of design. So in 2017, a McKinsey report found that design-driven global companies increased revenue by 32% faster. And another major global report concluded that at least 40% of global corporations now understand that design has to be at the heart of business process. So obviously in India, the electronics industry and technology, digital industries are key, because it's an area where India is already beginning to move ahead of quite a few developed economies. So the challenge for business in machine learning is to create services and workflows where machines complement each other. So again, people tend to be a bit scared of machine learning and those kinds of things, and your head goes kind of funny, and you need to actually remember that what you're always trying to do is make people's lives better. So you're not trying to design with data because that's the fashion, that's the trend, and that's where the money is. No, you're designing with data because you can make people's lives better. Just never lose sight of that. But obviously, we need to be aware of where these jobs are and how we're training people. So in creative higher education really needs to understand where our graduates are going to end up so that we can train them properly. So the other area that I think is particularly interesting for Kerala and for the Kochi region, because tourism is already a key industry here, but there's all kinds of technological and digital ways that you can use things like machine learning, but also content creation, to enhance tourist experience massively. So one of the areas that this is emerging is in UK museums. If you're walking around a museum or a gallery, every exhibit in it will have a little white label next to it telling you who did it, when they did it, and why we care, right? And this is really, you honestly, when you're walking around a museum, you're kind of going like, trying to read this wretched little label. So people are starting to use new technologies. So for example, you could actually project into the air a menu that lets you explore. So you can actually do this with tourism as well, using all kinds of things like facial recognition, image recognition, machine learning. So all of these opportunities are there to develop tourism. But at the same time, if you do this, then you'd actually be quite advanced and you would have really a market advantage. But at the same time, you can also use digital and just plain, good communications to globalize that tourist industry and get more foreign currency in. So again, it's about looking at what competitive advantages do you have, what problems do you have, and that drives your design process. I still can't turn a page. Okay, so what does the Future Design College do? I'm almost finished, I promise. The Future Design College is innovative and entrepreneurial. So about a third of you will go into creative businesses. About a third of you will end up doing admin in creative businesses. But most of you will need to understand what it is to be entrepreneurial because we're in an increasingly competitive global environment. And believe me, speaking from the UK, the fact that you're a leader is not permanent. You actually need to, even if you're going ahead, you need to have exactly the same, or as they say in the Lewis Carroll novel, it takes all the running you can do to stay in one place. It needs to be collaborative and embedded in place. You need to understand your environment, you need to understand your advantages and your problems specifically, but you also need to relate that to the global environment and what's happening all across the world. You need to be driving growth in national and regional economies as well as in industry sectors. And I've also found, speaking to Indian students, they're not that bothered about the notion of developing India, except in a very abstract sort of a way. But actually, there's no separation between developing industry and developing in a wider sense. Diversifying course provision, design degrees and graduate apprenticeships. So we really need to be in higher education very quick on our feet in redeveloping our courses to make sure that they're always up to date. Design research and consultancy. Research has always been an issue in Indian universities. It's extremely difficult to get international research funding, and there's very little research funding. But actually, I think one can hook up with international universities, but I think it's also important that an Indian research culture begins to develop, because in that way you possibly might be able to go around the problem of not being able to access the global sector. In other words, you make yourself so good that the sector has to take notice of you, basically, rather than trying to work through that existing sector. And the other thing is accelerating graduate startup ideas. So again, it's really important to encourage graduates to be scratching their own itches, and if they've got an idea to solve a problem, to make sure that they're able to turn that into a business if it's appropriate. And I think I now really have finished. Still can't turn a page. There's a bit of further reading, which is just what I happened to trip over last night rather than a comprehensive bibliography. But I think it's quite important to stay abreast of reports. And that's sort of my job in the UK, is to read those reports so everyone else doesn't have to. So that's... Any questions?
Something that I didn't understand is, why is it called the creative industry? Because I felt scientists, engineers, they're all creative. And if you're talking about the movie industry, I would rather call it an imaginative industry, where people have to imagine things. The moment they start connecting their imagination to the real world, won't they end up doing the same or executing the same process as an engineer or a scientist?
This discussion goes on in the UK as well, and increasingly what we're trying to do is blur lines between science and creativity. So there's, the acronym STEM, science, technology, engineering and maths. People have put an A in the middle, so it's science, technology, art and maths, engineering, art and maths. I don't know, it's gone out of my head, so you might as well speak.
How is the hierarchy? Like, you have engineers, on top of that designers who connect all these pieces together for the client, and then on top of them creative artists. How does it all fit together?
That's exactly exactly what we need to do, is break down these hierarchies, because everyone's contribution is equally vital and everybody has to be open and listen to everybody else. So basically, this is precisely what we're trying to do with design thinking, basically, is to get rid of this notion that there's a hierarchy of expertise or that there's a hierarchy of authority. Because when you do that, you're silencing people, and you're very often silencing exactly the people that you should have been listening to. Because if you're designing for an environment and you're silencing half the people in that process, you're losing all kinds of rich insights that would have been helpful. So instead of working in this very organized, hierarchical way, you're trying to work in a much more collaborative way. And actually, I think for India, this is going to be relatively easy. Well, actually, you've probably got the same problems we have, in that it's a very hierarchical society, and these concepts are quite difficult to... it's quite difficult to move people from this static hierarchical way of working into a much more collaborative way of working. And that's another reason why I champion micro-businesses. Because when you're working in a very small company, you have to be collaborative with other companies, because you can't deliver a project by yourself. So you're constantly having to argue about whether you should do it this way or that way, and that process is innovative, because what you end up with is usually better than what either one would have done by themselves, if that makes sense. It's called the creative industries because of what the product is. So basically, obviously, a scientist is imaginative and creative, but what he's going to produce is a functional object, generally speaking, or infrastructure. The creative industries are called that because their product is purely a creation, if you see what I mean. It doesn't do anything else. You know, you enjoy it, or but it's not actually a functional object. It's all of these things. However you carve these things up, it's not going to work for somebody. But you have to have a functional language for talking about things, you know. What can I tell you?
Hello?
Yeah, better. Okay.
My name is Srijit. I'm working as a UX designer. You are talking about, like, you people are talking to the universities to change their curriculum to have advanced things. But in India, most of the students are funding by their parents. And these parents doesn't know anything about the designing era or the designing curriculum or anything. How will we address this problem?
Well, this is why I was talking about the CC Skills project that I talked about in one of the slides. And again, then we have the problem, who's going to fund that? So basically, my feeling is that industry needs to fund that, because industry has the problem of not having enough qualified people. So basically, what needs to happen is we need to work out how to fund a systematic approach. So we need to define the roles clearly and produce something like the cards we produced in the UK. But they'll probably be a little bit different because industry has different structures in India. So we need to actually repeat the process. I don't think we can just use the UK one, but we could use that framework as an idea to work from. So we need to do several things. First of all, we need to codify what these roles are in a way that parents can understand. We need to send people from the creative industries into schools, because I think that if children, teachers, and parents see someone successful explaining how they got into the industry, what it is they do, and what it is they earn, then this will do a lot to move. You know, you have to, if you're trying to deal with a new idea, most people have to actually see it. And I think we also need to, because the Indian curriculum has, as far as I can tell, no creative element. So it's also so the parents have never been exposed to creative disciplines. So there's not much we can do about that, but we can make sure that future generations, whatever career you're going into, you have been exposed to creative disciplines. And in order to do that at the moment, I think the universities are going to have to step up and provide the staff to go into schools. Or I also know someone in Delhi who's got a small company, and she's going into schools and providing creative input and just charging the schools. But if the schools don't understand that they need that, so this is not something we're going to solve tomorrow, but there are models that we can look at to begin to address that problem, because we've had the same problem in the UK.
Thank you.